Um, I'm really honored to be here. As Partho has told you, that I am a scientist turned historian. I've had formal training in chemistry and research in chemistry. But for the last 2 decades or more, I've been working on history of science. I'm afraid I can no longer call myself either a scientist or a historian, but I am a concerned scholar. And it is this concern with the world as it is that drives my research. My book, Dispersed Radiance, which Partho talked about, talks about gender and caste in the making of science. So I'm particularly interested in the culture of science. And today, not only culture of science and producing scientific knowledge, but as well as how scientific institutions functions, what are some of the roadblocks that we see in these institutions. So today my talk will be on caste and science. And I will begin with talking about some very recent events and then link them to 100 years ago, and then maybe try to draw some lessons from that linkages. In discovering caste prejudice in science laboratories, Unheard Narratives, an abstract submitted for the 2016 Sociology Conference at the University of Hyderabad, Rohit Vemula had drawn upon his own experiences at the university to show how caste inequalities are reproduced in life science laboratories through ubiquitous exclusion and humiliation of reserve category students. Although the conference committee duly rejected the abstract, the issues Vemula raised have become paramount in recent months. Rohit Vemula's suicide, or as some have called it, institutional murder, has brought to light the everyday violence meted out to Dalit students at the highest echelons of academic institutions in India. When Rohit Vemula wrote to P. Appa Rao, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hyderabad, asking him to, quote, please serve 10 milligrams of sodium azide to all the Dalit students at the time of admission, supply a nice robe to the rooms of all Dalit students, he was invoking the history of atrocities that have taken and continue to take the lives of Dalit students, especially in the discipline of science. Death of Merit, a Dalit students' portal, lists 19 suicides across India's premier institutions, the IITs, the IIMs, IISc, to name a few, in a short span of 2007 to 2011, and that is by far not a complete list. Some of these students came from rural families where they were the first ever to step inside an educational institution. They could not have known what awaited them in these places. They could not have imagined the deep caste prejudice that would confront them, or how vicious would be the behavior of some of their fellow students, professors, and administrators, and how tormented and isolated they would be made to feel inside these portals of higher learning. They would not know any of it, in part because the normative claims of scientists about their field of inquiry are that science is devoid of prejudice. It is value neutral, and objectivity is its bedrock. Indeed, Rohit Vemula, who had, quote, loved science, stars, nature, unquote, who saw science as a force for social change, and who would talk endlessly about green technologies when he joined the master's program in science at the University of Hyderabad, must have been unprepared for the treatment meted out to him. And Rohit was not alone. In 2008, Senthil Kumar, a PhD student in the Department of Physics, took his life. Writing for the News Minute, S. Ramanathan describes the rampant discrimination at the university as reported by a fact-finding committee headed by Professor Vinod Pavarala. And I quote the findings. The committee findings were shocking and showed a thriving culture of caste discrimination in the School of Science. In Senthil's batch, 4, including him, were not assigned supervisors. All of them were from reserved categories. Under pressure to perform and with no guidance, Senthil failed in one of the courses, due to which he stopped receiving his fellowship stipend. Hailing from a poor family of pig breeders in rural Tamil Nadu, Senthil succumbed to the pressure and killed himself. Two others who were not given supervisors left the program. In flagrant infringement of the rules of the fellowship, which is not supposed to be linked to performance in coursework, not only was Senthil's stipend stopped, his name was broadcast on the notice board, citing his failure in coursework as the reason. According to the Senthil Kumar Solidarity Committee, the punitive logic of linking the fellowship to a performance is a tool of punishment in the hands of the authorities against students, rather than a means to support their education. Further, the Solidarity Committee noted that the pure sciences have been completely fenced off from a social audit in the name of objectivity and national progress. It is significant that the latest round of agitations against reservation has been spearheaded by medical professionals, engineers, and the IT sector. These disciplines have been at the forefront of pitting merit against politics, where one lies in the domain of truth and objectivity, while the other is merely a politician's whim. The survival of these disciplines is linked to the prestige attached to them by virtue of their exclusivity. Science is important inasmuch as the masses cannot approach it. Science is an exclusive domain and zealously guarded as such. The inventories of discrimination elucidated by the Death of Merit portal, the testimonies of Dalit students about the treatment meted out to them, the experiences of Rohit Vemula and Senthil Kumar and many others, unfortunately fall upon deaf ears, as the Dalit student is always stamped with the badge of inferiority and unworthiness in the eyes of the upper caste. Thus, these tragedies remain personal, failing to elicit neither introspection by the powers that be, nor sustained demands by the academic community for meaningful reforms. Such was not the case a century ago, when in the face of discriminatory treatment meted out to Indian students by the colonial authorities, notable Indian scientists and influential people from all walks of life voiced their opposition and demanded sweeping changes in the educational policies of the colonial government. We know this from a 12-volume report of the Sadler Commission. In 1917, the Governor General of India established the Calcutta University Commission. The aftermath of the Bengal partition had given rise to widespread discontent in the universities. As the universities became breeding grounds for revolutionaries, their internal working came under attack from the colonial government. Representatives of the government opposed appointments of lecturers and professors to the newly created College of Science at the University of Calcutta, further bolstering the perception that the government was bent upon restricting higher education in Bengal. The Calcutta University Commission, headed by M.E. Sadler, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds, was to inquire into the educational status of the university. To this end, the Commission circulated an exhaustive questionnaire concerning the organization of the university, its infrastructure, the standard of examination, and distribution of teachers to about 670 people. These included the Bengal members of the Imperial Legislative Council, the ordinary fellows of Calcutta University, members of Postgraduate Council in Arts and Sciences, directors of public instructions, principals of colleges, inspectors and headmasters of school, and the Vice-Chancellor of all Indian universities, and some members of the commercial community. The questionnaire dealt in some depth about teaching, administration, examination, dormitories, education of women and minorities, etc. The report thus offers a window into the dominant ideas and opinions of the Indian intelligentsia regarding education, rights of minorities, status of women, and the question of caste distinctions. Prominent Indian scientists and educators voiced their opinions on issues relevant to science education in the University of Calcutta in particular, and higher education in general. For the purposes of my talk today, I want to draw upon a few of these issues. On the question of the examination system, C.V. Raman, the 1930 Nobel laureate in physics, wrote a general memorandum to the Sadler Commission where he expressed his profound misgivings. I quote, "Year after year, in some Indian universities, we have the repetition of the scandalous sight of a huge percentage of failures in the university examinations. I have no hesitation in saying that if the percentage of the passes and failures in the university examination were exactly reversed, we would have a truer representation of the intellectual caliber of the students. Numerous instances are within my personal knowledge in which candidates of real ability who would in any of the world's universities have obtained high distinctions have been suicide." Citing the well-known case of S. Ramanujan, failing more than once in his intermediate examinations, Raman observed that this case was not a case of mere eccentricity of genius. Rather, there were hundreds of cases in which candidates of real ability were shut out from the universities by most arbitrary and unsympathetic standard of examination. The keynote of education, he asserted, is sympathy. Without it, the ablest teacher can only prove a miserable failure. I quote, "In the administration of our college and universities, we find the very reverse of sympathy put in practice. The breaking of the spirit of the ambitious student who wishes to take up honors course, but is refused permission, or worse still, is allowed in and kicked out after summary trial, is an event of regular occurrence in the Madras University. His treatment after he secures his degree is even worse. Scholarships in the universities are asked for only to be refused." The distinguished astrophysicist Meghnad Saha expressed similar sentiments regarding the examination system, citing that he personally knew of, quote, "the dire effect which the system produces on its unfortunate victims. Dejected in mind and spirits, struggling with poverty and ill health for retrieving lost honor and a good name, the ultimate result is often fogging of the brain and complete breakdown of health." Saha asked for leniency, citing that the system was unnecessarily rigid. The experience of students of science, regardless of caste, in the early 20th century and of Dalit students today could not be more similar. Yet the response meted out to them could not be more different. Indian scientists and educators in the early 20th century viewed the plight of their largely, though not exclusively, upper caste students sympathetically, and hence exposed systemic and structural problems in the examination system. They demanded both reform in the system as well as representation in the decision-making bodies to meet the needs of their students. In stark contrast, despite widespread disillusionment with the educational system as a whole, when it comes to Dalit students, the conversation on science education shifts almost entirely on the worthiness or lack thereof of the concerned students, with not a word about structural inequities. On a related issue, the question of who qualifies as a suitable teacher, the upper caste scientists of the past, including Prafulla Chandra Ray, C.V. Raman, Jagdish Chandra Bose, the upper caste scientists of the past were unanimous in their emphasis on hiring Indian teachers in order to generate, quote, a feeling of real sympathy towards students, and for, quote, a genuine enthusiasm and spirit of service and devotion, such as one can feel towards one's own country. P.C. Ray further elaborated on the qualities of an ideal teacher, quote, a teacher to inspire his pupils must not live detached and isolated from their society, but must live and move and have his being among them. In one way or the other, all these respondents saw in the suitable teacher a reflection of themselves and conveyed, albeit indirectly, a sense of alienation from their foreign teachers. The need for greater representation in postgraduate education and research institutions seems paramount in these responses that seem to take academic qualifications of the candidate for granted. The one exception was Meghnad Saha, who seemed unconcerned with the nationality of ideal teachers. His response was directed entirely to the different kinds of expertise needed for graduate and postgraduate instruction. Saha believed that teachers from undergraduate instruction need to have strong research interests, but need not have strong research interests, but should have an intimate knowledge of his subject and powers of lucid exposition, while the ones in charge of guiding graduate students should have done some original work in their subject and who take an active interest in the progress of their subject. I just want to clarify here, all of the quotes that I'm giving you are, of course, exclude women. They're all about men, and so, you know, I want us to just remember that. Even though women's education at that time was a paramount concern in the university. Saha's indifference to the need to identify with the instructors is noteworthy. His indifference, particularly since there is such a convergence in the responses of his peers on this issue. It can be interpreted as his lack of social belonging in the decidedly upper caste milieu of the academic life. Nonetheless, the importance preeminent scientists of a century ago placed on identity and representation in order to better impart science education and training might encourage us to think more sympathetically to the need for greater gender and caste representation in higher echelons of scientific research in the present times. The impulse for expansion and democratization of science education prompted many scientists to campaign for the teaching of science in the vernacular. Meghnad Saha felt that the present system, and I'm quoting, that the present system is a most unnatural one. The student is asked to learn, to unlearn the ways of thinking which come to him most naturally, and asked to think in a tongue, every word of which he must pick up and retain in his memory with an effort, instead of allowing him sufficient time to familiarize himself with the language. We prescribe a time limit within which he must attain as much fluency in the language as the average English boy of 13 and 14. The result is that he has recourse to a process of perpetual memorizing and translation, a habit that he can never shake off in later life. The desirability of teaching science in the vernacular was voiced equally strongly by S.N. Bose, who, when confronted with the argument that the absence of suitable technical terms in Indian languages may prove to be a hindrance for the study of the sciences, declared, quote, "I'm not a purist and would welcome the continued use of technical and scientific terms in English. If our boys can understand them easily, they will continue as loan words, and I hope they will ultimately be absorbed and enrich our national vocabulary." The views of India's preeminent scientists on evaluation of students by the all too rigid and examination system, the dearth of role models for Indian students who were forced to learn from unsympathetic foreign teachers, and the pitfalls of learning in a foreign tongue are uncannily similar to the concerns voiced by Dalit students and activists 100 years later. The experience of feeling humiliation, mental despair to the point of suicide, the breaking of the spirit of ambitious Indian students in colonial India, too, resemble the plight of Dalit students today. Just as white supremacy of British educators and administrators engendered a general devaluation of the caliber of Indian students, the lack of concern, let me just reread it, just as the general devaluation of the caliber of Indian students by British educators and administrators was engendered by notions of white supremacy, the lack of concern, if not outright hostility, shown by the academic community towards Dalit students, too, is rooted in mentalities of caste, where, to reiterate a phrase from P.C. Ray, the Dalit student is always stamped with a badge of inferiority and unworthiness. Post-colonial India has seen the replacement of colonial hierarchies by hierarchies of caste, class, and religion, where caste privileges stand in for white privilege. The ubiquitous presence of caste in the personal lives of scientists, in the very structures of scientific institutions, and consequently in the formulation of science policy, naturalizes caste such that upper castes become the norm and caste discrimination is rendered invisible. It is therefore not a surprise that apart from Meghnad Saha, not one other scientist bothered to comment upon issues directly related to caste raised by the Sadler Commission, such as the question of the residential needs and interests of Muslims and disadvantaged castes. Further, the response of Saha is markedly different from, say, the response of the moral philosopher Rajendranath Seal, not only in its content, but also in the language used to describe the situation. I quote Saha's response at some length. Saha wrote, if the residential system be adopted, I think that proper care should be taken for the accommodation of students of democratic classes. I use this term to denote these classes, which are usually, but sometimes, very unjustly styled depressed classes. It is a standing complaint that at present time, the hostels that are attached to the colleges are practically the monopoly of a few aristocratic classes, the Brahmins, the Kayasthas, the Vaidyas. Members of democratic classes are either not admitted, or if at all admitted, they are allowed to live not as a matter of right, but as a matter of grace. If any student of the orthodox type demurs to living with them in the same room and taking meals in the same dining hall, the unfortunate student is asked to remove to some other place and take his meals in his own room. The writer knows of several instances where this state of things has actually existed. Now, just for your information, I want to tell you that as a child, Meghnad Saha had been ordered by the priest to leave the dais where prayers were being offered to the goddess Saraswati because he did not belong to the right caste. In the student residences at Eden Hindu Hostel in Calcutta, some students refused to eat with him in the dining hall, forcing Saha and in protest his fellow students Jyan Ghosh, Bhupen Ghosh and Neil Ratandhar to set up residences elsewhere. Saha's tenure at Allahabad University, where he became the professor of physics, was also mired in social difficulties. A.C. Banerjee, one of the members of the Executive Council of the Allahabad University, which appointed Saha, and who later on became the Vice-Chancellor of the university, recalled, quote, in the 20s, when Saha came to Allahabad, the society there was still very orthodox. In consequence, Saha and his wife had sometimes to experience social difficulties. It is no surprise then that the tenor of Saha's writing here is both personal and uncompromising and stands in contrast to the response of Brajendranath Seal on the same question. While Seal censored caste discrimination in no uncertain terms, his comments lacked the insight and, more importantly, Saha's language of resistance. According to Seal, and I quote, "So far as residential and other arrangements are concerned, the educationally backward communities or those below the waterline, like the Mohammedans on the one hand and the Sahas, Suvarnavaniks and Namashudras on the other, have separate claims on the public funds and should be represented on the students' residence committees in the universities, but every college hostel should provide an additional heterodox department which should be open to members of all community without distinction of caste or creed. The humiliating position assigned to students of the so-called lower caste in some hostels, not all private institutions, is a running sore which should be stopped at once." The semantic as well as ideological differences between Saha and his colleagues are significant, even though both decry caste discrimination. Seal names the lower caste to highlight their educational backwardness. Saha, on the other hand, in a rhetorical move that self-consciously conflates class with caste, names the upper caste and their privileged position in the society. He rallies against value judgments inherent in phrases such as the depressed classes and balks at the treatment meted out to them. While Seal points to separate claims on the public fund for the educationally backward communities, Saha emphasizes equal rights for the members of the democratic classes, protesting the entitlement of the aristocratic classes. And while Seal laments the humiliation of the so-called lower caste, Saha writes of self-respect and dignity of the democratic classes. I quote from Saha, "Now the members of democratic classes feel that in at least these hostels, which have been constructed at public expense, they have the same rights as members of other classes. They expect that they should be admitted freely and allowed to live in a manner consistent with their ideas of self-respect and dignity. It will not do if separate hostels are opened for them, for in that case, at least 25 separate communal hostels should be opened for each college, one for the use of each particular community." Finally, in contrast to Seal's recommendation that an additional heterodox department be open to all members of the community, Saha campaigns against separate facilities for any caste and demands that all hostels built with public funds be accessible to all communities. I quote, "The government, as a matter of principle, does not make any distinction of caste or creed in points of law or employment. The same principle should be adopted in this case. Those students or communal leaders who find it irreligious to dine with their fellow brethren of other castes should be asked to shift for themselves, construct hostels at their own expense. They should not be allowed or encouraged to introduce a feeling of discord in the pure academic atmosphere." The intentional avoidance of terms like backward or lower caste by Saha reveals a political perspective that eschews victimization discourse, where caste discrimination is seen as an aberration which can be redressed by giving special consideration to the oppressed. Saha's exaggerated but masterful use of aristocratic classes puts the onus of special consideration onto those who have historically guarded and maintained their privileged status. The semantic shift from the language of special consideration, which embodies aspersions of less than equal and patronization, to the democratic rights of people, signals a move which demands equality and democratization of all aspects of academic life. Significantly, Saha refrained from including his personal experience in his response. Rather, he assumed objective knowledge of several instances of caste discrimination. Saha subscribed to the notion that science was impersonal, objective, and free from all social considerations, and even a hint of subjectivity would taint it. In these ways, he certainly did not realize that casting of science as pure and sublime is not unlike the self-representation of the aristocratic castes. Physics reigns supreme in the hierarchy of sciences, and its characterization as highbrow, objective, and abstract knowledge demands that its practitioners erase subjective experience, ideological biases, and social difference from their consideration. These constraints, however, function only for the subaltern, as the biographies of upper caste scientists invariably reinforce ideologies of caste, hierarchy, and power. In fact, every biography of upper caste scientists starts with this glorified lineage, and if they cannot find that lineage, it is the place is somehow a mecca for the high achievement of that particular caste. Indeed, hierarchies of gender and caste on the one hand, and on the other of science, ensure the compliance of women and low caste scientists in keeping the domain of physics unsullied, unencumbered by inventories of discrimination. M.S.S. Pandian has argued that the Indian modern, despite its claim to be universal, and of course because of it, not only constitutes lower caste as its other, but also inscribes itself silently as upper caste. Thus, the survival of the subaltern in the disciplines of the quintessentially modern sciences is incumbent upon silencing the language of caste, as well as demanding and enforcing that caste can live only secret lives outside the public sphere. Saha had incurred the ire of the upper caste firsthand when he made a rather mild criticism of the Hindu religion and of the caste system in a lecture delivered at Shantiniketan in 1938. Saha's main point was that craftsmen, artists, and builders have been traditionally placed quite low in the social hierarchy, which had engendered a lack of innovativeness in the techniques of production. Saha's lecture prompted a scathing response from a certain Anil Baran Roy, accusing Saha of misleading interpretations. Although Saha held his own, and more, in a series of rejoinders, the very fact that his opinions were publicly rebuked substantiates Pandian argument that the language of caste may reside only in the private domain. The hierarchy in science aligns itself imperceptibly with caste hierarchy. The enculturation in sciences thus privileges upper caste identities as it suppresses the expression of subaltern politics. It also serves to fracture subaltern identities where one can be a subaltern or a physicist, but not both, as the ultimate resistance of Rohit, Senthil, and many others bear witness to. And it is something that women scientists have also written about. You could either be women or scientists, but not women scientists, if you wanted to be fully accepted in the scientific institutions. The wall of silence around science and caste needs to be cracked open if we are to democratize our institutions of science. The narratives of discrete individual acts of resistance, of the language of equality and emancipation, need to be circulated and discussed. For these serve not only to elucidate how social structures work to distribute power and disadvantage, but in the process amplify individual resistances such that they become part and parcel of our collective conscious, our cultural and social ethos. As Jean and John Kamarov write so eloquently, for once its internal contradictions are revealed, when what seemed natural comes to be negotiable, when the ineffable is put into words, then hegemony becomes something other than itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Sur. That was a wonderful and a provocative lecture. Are there any questions for Professor Sur?
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful talk. So you actually addressed the question towards the end that several women actually say that you can't be either woman or a scientist, but not both. And that's related to the direct discrimination that women scientists face in the scientific world. But I somehow feel more concerned about the indirect discrimination, which is clearly evident in the gender ratio in the physics class that I study. And if I track the classes of the 5 previous years and the 3 years next to me, and calculate the gender ratio in each of them, then it's pretty skewed. It's a skewed ratio. And even going at a far lower level, say if I ask 100 class 10 kids that what do you want to do when you grow up, then the number of students that will say that I want to study physics, that ratio is very skewed towards male population. Now, that is not based on direct discrimination, but the direct discrimination can be removed by implying laws and creating committees. But this indirect discrimination that is inherent in the society, and that's making the decision of the students skewed at a very early age. How do you address that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think many scholars have written about the how socialization into stereotype genders begins to occur on day one, and and the difference between families that are gender conscious, want to do something consciously about their daughters, have a very different, they create a very different atmosphere. I mean, in general, of course, there are always exceptions, as we know. So it's not surprising that even in 10th grade, women, I could give you a story from my own son's experience. He had this wonderful young child like him, a daughter of a friend, who would come and say how so-and-so is such a genius because he got 100 marks in an exam. So her mother pointed out, but you got 100 too. And yet she would not place herself in the same category as she would, the boy in her class. So I think, and this is, post-feminist revolution, where larger numbers of women are more attuned to socialization of gender at very early ages. So the larger society and the ways in which these norms are articulated and reinforced again and again through, like Gramsci wrote, through schools, through religious teachings, through every aspect of social life, so the individual cannot really be overcome. So that's why when I was talking about the culture of science, it is us who have to change our ethos. We have to engage with these stories. We have to be sympathetic towards these, continued stories of discrimination. And unless we do that, then our own ethos is not going to change. So it's not that there are no laws in India. In fact, there are many laws. There are very wonderful policies that Indian government has instituted to encourage women to come into sciences. And yet what happens is, the pressures of family, so other aspects of life also has to be taken into consideration. A lot of the time, and it's the woman who does all the household work. It's the woman who has to be primarily responsible for the children. Men do much less. It's changing very slowly, but it continues to be the norm the world over. And these put enormous hurdles in the experiences, in the careers of women scientists, women professionals everywhere. Some more so than in some other countries.
There's a question here.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a wonderful talk. I just want to
say that what do you think about the object of caste reservations? Because when the system tells us that you are a Dalit, so you belong to reserved category, you are weak, and so we are giving you some seats in academic places or in jobs places, and automatically the people from the general categories, they started to feel that we are already being discriminated because they are getting the seats. It's not that according to merit, maybe they are not able, but at the moment we are reserving them according to caste, they are already starting to thinking that the discrimination is done by the state. So that's why we are weak and they are giving up the opportunities and we are leading forward. So instead of that, if we think to reserve systems according to the economic conditions of the student and according to merit, then wouldn't that be fair that we can remove the discrimination of the class and treat the students or the person according to their merit? What's your opinion?
No, it's a dilemma that many have pointed out. But I think we need to understand the ways in which caste, class, gender, etc., interact with each other. Studies have shown that even when you come from, say, a middle class. I know the studies on race in the US where there's an enormous scholarship. So even when you come from, say, solidly professional, class or from, say, blacks, African Americans, it takes a few generations to solidify the impact of education and this thing. So they can slip very easily back to their position is very tentative. So it isn't just a question of, it's not a simple question of caste versus class. It is the ways in which caste interacts with class and interacts with gender, because the reverse happens quite readily unless we pay attention. But also, reservations will not do much if we do not change the culture of the institutions as well, which is another, which is something that I've been talking about in my, address today. So I think it is true, and I think that at the face of it, it makes so much more sense to make a class-based reservation scheme. But these prejudices that we hold, unfortunately, take a long time to dissipate. It's not that there have not been major struggles. Things improve a bit, then we slip back to the old ways. So the struggle has to continue, and I personally think that both are important.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Shujakala Chatterjee, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Physics. So you talked about caste-based discrimination, and you mentioned gender-based discrimination. But as we all know that there are discrimination based on ethnicity, race, as you mentioned, anything you can think of. So what would be your record? So I know that in many universities around the world, there are very structured programs that actually take proactive role in making aware the university community at large about discrimination and how they can be very aware and kind of take proactive measures in stopping this. So do you have recommendations for universities all around in India that what structured measures can they take through the curriculum or through code of conduct by which students and faculty and the community at large become more aware about discriminatory behavior and how to fight them back?
Yeah, thank you. I always hesitate to give recommendations because I don't think it's my place. But at the same time, I want to say something like, say that at MIT, which until a decade or two ago was predominantly a men's university. Today it's 50-50 almost. And actually, if you looked at the application pool, the women could probably fill 70% of the seats because, fortunately or unfortunately, women are doing so much better in any kind of standards of evaluation that we may have. And yet, after women come to MIT, there is a general perception that they were given admission preferentially because they were women. And similar cases I've heard of Dalit scholars as well. Somebody who comes through the merit list, does not come through reservation list, is treated the way in which, as if they came from reservation list. And that is why my own emphasis in what we can do. We as academicians, we as scientists, what can we do to change that ethos? Because there will always be that aspersion. That's precisely what P.C. Ray was writing about when he talked about how Indian students were treated in Britain or within, because there was always this stamp of unworthiness on them before they even entered anything. And I think that's precisely, and if you actually follow the kind of, it may not be evident here, but I've heard from many of my colleagues, the kind of conversations that happen in the staff rooms, etc., they are just so oblivious that they are being quite atrocious to gender and to caste, because, as I said, the norm is upper caste man. Similarly, in the US, it's the white the white male. And therefore, unless we begin to be aware of what it actually means, because I remember when I was in a laboratory, which was quite lovely to me, but I had to learn, the intricacies of American football, which I have absolutely no interest in, but if I wanted to be accepted in the laboratory, that's where the conversations was. You go on Friday evening, go for a beer, talk about football, and in between some science. So either you're totally excluded or you got to play along with the boys. And I'm sure there are subtle ways, and I wasn't really unhappy. I quite enjoyed at that time, though I'm horrified now that I actually sat and watched those violent games. But what I'm trying to say is that there has to be much greater sensitivity to the general cultural ethos in laboratories.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I have a vague memory of something that Jan Prakash had written in Other Reason. And he was talking about this moment of absolute social revolution when Indian students at the Calcutta Medical College were first allowed to or asked to dissect the human body.
Yeah.
And as you said, the generic idea was that those students would be upper caste and male. But I wonder what kinds of changes that might have produced, that suddenly upper caste men were asked to touch a cadaver, and not just touch, but actually handle it in ways that we considered otherwise polluting.
Yeah.
Did it produce any kind of thinking that might have loosened some aspects of caste?
Yeah. Again, I think from my reading of the literature, any time a way of being or any job becomes professionalized, it is taken over by men because it just becomes so much more prestigious. It accrues, a lot of benefit. So I think these notions shift very, very quickly. If the profession, I think I read somewhere about biotechnology here, that in the early phases, when it wasn't clear where the field was going, it was largely women that came into biotechnology, but as the field grew and became professionalized, men began to take over. And we have a history of that throughout the 19th, 20th century. You look at nurse, all kinds of professions where once opportunities become lucrative and the field changes, people give up their, prejudices, at least for themselves, but not necessarily, and take on these professions. So I think that that in itself doesn't really sort of explain that there would be loosening of caste discrimination. That's my understanding.
wonderful talk and so topical across the world in so many countries. I lived long years in the US and also Australia, and I just want to raise this issue of Australia because Australia really wide Australia policy till about 1970. Mm-hmm. And the people who were clearly, when I went to Australia and met those people, they have changed themselves. Mm-hmm. Before 1970, they were going along with the white Australia policy. Mm-hmm. And then after that, some of them I know very well, and there's no remnant of that sort of thinking anymore.
Absolutely.
So I believe in the same in US. When I first went, and I was in fact in the biology department of MIT, mm-hmm. and in fact Evelyn Fox Keller's brother, Maury Fox, he was mm-hmm. in the department. And when I talked to Maury, I was much more, found him much more affectionate than my teachers in Dhaka University, mm-hmm. with whom I could never sit down mm-hmm. in the same room. So I believe in human capacity to change. And one issue you did not touch is that after Dr. Ambedkar and all these years in India, Gandhi and Ambedkar, why is this an issue still? Why didn't India change like the Australians changed?
I think that change is never a linear process. I think there were massive changes made, but there is also regression. Sometimes it depends on political, economic conditions. Right now, we are looking, as many speakers before me talked about, the way in which Europe is going, the way in which US is going, the election of Trump and all of that. So it isn't that it's a linear process of change. And some of the changes that have occurred because of the civil rights movement in the US, because of the feminist movement, have become totally normalized. So that women who actually don't believe in feminism are already benefiting from that revolution in a way. So it isn't that the whole of Australia has changed first. There still remain problems. And then we keep increasing our aspirations as well for a democratic country. And when the economic downturn happens, you also see a whole lot of regressive elements taking hold. So I would say that one can never be complacent. It's a continuous struggle that we have to wage. Both within ourselves as well as in the society at large.